Amnesty International has just called for the prosecution of former President George Bush for torture. Well, Americans don't need any foreign organization to call for the prosecution of George Bush, because every real American demands that George Bush answers for his crimes. Every true American must also demand prosecution of Barack Obama, for Obama continues the same torture policies of Bush through the so-called rendition program. Obama also continues to commit murder of hundreds of innocent women and children in increasing drone attacks in a nation that's our ally, Pakistan. Both Bush and Obama have sent captured enemies to third countries where they are tortured, and that's equivalent to a crime boss turning over his victims to his henchmen to administer the torture. A person who authorizes rendition is himself guilty of torture. When I was a very young man, America was a different kind of nation. I was taught that Americans didn't torture, that torture was evil, that communists did that. Torture was immoral, we were taught, even for someone convicted of heinous crimes. If a murderer is fairly tried and convicted, he might even deserve the death penalty, but you didn't torture him.
To make
Long
sure
before
that the
Zionists
bond
took
between the
control
United
of
States and
our
Israel
government, our foreign policy, and our media, our founding fathers, such as Washington and Jefferson, would have charged, tried, convicted, and executed any American guilty of torturing an enemy soldier. In addition, torture only causes more violence and terrorism against innocent Americans, because such evil actions only intensify the hatred for America around the world and motivates more terrorist attacks against us. So torture actually endangers Americans. Zionist fanatics don't worry about that fact, because they know that they can make use of every new attack against America to stir up support for Israel. Now, Obama recently broke his promise and stopped release of new pictures of Abu Ghraib. Pictures are not the problem. The problem is what America has become. It hurts my heart to think that America is now a nation whose government agents homosexually rape and sodomize men and boys, whose government agents sick vicious dogs to naked, helpless prisoners. From where did we learn this kind of horror? Well, you're going to find out right now. For years, Israel's been torturing Palestinians in their dungeons. Joel Greenberg, in the very pro-Israel New York Times, stated matter-of-factly that Israel for years has tortured 500 to 600 Palestinians every month. That's at least 150,000 Palestinians tortured in the last 30 years. As Zionists seized complete control of American foreign policy, our government, and the media, it was inevitable that America would eventually engage in the same kinds of evil as Israel. Robert Fisk, an award-winning journalist of The Independent in Britain, points out that a key figure at Abu Ghraib was a, quote, third country national named John Israel. Now, can you guess the nationality of Mr. John Israel? In a July 3, 2004 report by Britain's BBC entitled Israeli Interrogators in Iraq, it said that, quote, the American in charge of Abu Ghraib itself, General Janis Karpinski, claimed that Israeli interrogators were there. The two top architects of our Mideast foreign policy under George Bush were Richard Perle and Paul Wolfowitz. They and their Zionist cohorts, Libby, Crystal, Feith, Wormser, Abrams, and a host of others just like them, and an overwhelmingly Zionist media, gave us the catastrophic Iraq War and Afghanistan War. Wars for Israel based on lies. Wars that have cost Americans trillions of dollars, at least 1 million innocent civilian lives overseas, and hundreds of thousands of brain-damaged, crippled, maimed, or dead Americans. Of course, it was not just Republicans who supported these wars for Israel. so did an amorphous body of neocons and traditional Jewish liberals. The rabidly Zionist neocons actually have communist roots, just like the Jewish leftists have communist roots. The father of modern neoconservatism, Irving Kristol, is a former Trotskyite communist who, along with other communist Jews, realized that communism wouldn't sell to the American people. So they decided to infiltrate conservative and moderate politics. Paul Wolfowitz and Norman Podhoretz were also dedicated followers of Leon Trotsky, the head of the Red Army. Podhoretz himself in the New York Times pointed out that, quote, many Jews on the left are passionately pro-Israel, but that isn't true of the left in general, unquote. In the U.S. Congress, there are many Jewish liberals, but it is no surprise that every Jewish liberal there is passionately pro-Israel. Now, torturous policy goes right back to the communist roots of both Jewish leftists and the Jewish neoconservatives. Nobel Prize winner Alexander Solzhenitsyn, on page 79 of his book, Gulag Archipelago II, shows the 6 top administrators of the worst murder and torture machine in the history of the world. They were Aaron Sholz, Yakov Rappaport, Lazar Kogan, Madbai Berman, Gingrich Yagoda, and Naftali Franco. Every single one was of Jewish origin, just like the most well-known supporter of torture today in America, Alan Dershowitz. Now, Dershowitz came out and advocated that America should torture suspects, people who have not even yet been convicted of anything. Now, the media calls Dershowitz a, quote, human rights or civil rights attorney. What makes him a human rights attorney? Ironically, former Jewish Bolsheviks in control of America have taken over the same prisons in Eastern Europe where the original Bolsheviks had run them years before. Between the neoconservatives subverting conservatism and good old-fashioned Jewish commies subverting liberalism, really, what chance does real freedom or real human rights have in the world today? But let's not forget the final element in the promotion of torture, the vicious values taught by the Jewish-dominated media, both in entertainment and news. Endless numbers of Jewish-made TV programs and movies promote police, soldiers, or citizens torturing the, quote, bad guys in pursuit of a, quote, good cause. A perfect example is the Weinstein production, Inglourious Basterds. Now that's how they pronounce it, Bastards. It glorifies and makes sadistic torture cool and funny and portrays vicious Jewish torturers of regular German soldiers as, quote, heroes. Here's an excerpt.
You know something, you rich? I think this just might be my masterpiece.
Now watch my video, Hollywood Bastards. Do you think the Jewish news media criticize this blatant promotion of sadistic torture, a violation of the Geneva Conventions? No, of course not. I shudder to think of a helpless Palestinian in the grasp of Jews inspired by the sadism and torture of this movie. So how did America turn into a nation that openly tortures people? It began in the 20th century, which Jewish writer Sleskin calls the Jewish century. Now, from the Middle Ages to the present, European nations endeavored to make war less horrific. Civilian cities and populations were increasingly proscribed from attack. Those who tortured or raped were punished. Now, all this process came to an end in what Schleskind calls the Jewish century. It began with Jewish-led Bolshevism, which launched the greatest mass murder and torture the world's ever seen. And later in the Second World War, thanks to their great influence in the Allied nations, they promoted the purposeful mass murder of civilian populations through bombing of cities. And that culminated in the bombings of Dresden and the dropping of atomic bombs on Japanese cities. Now imagine the horror of your children burned to death as they slept in their beds. Not just Germans have experienced this on a mass scale, so have Palestinians. On the Soviet side, Jewish propaganda chief Ilya Ehrenberg sent millions of pamphlets to Soviet soldiers that openly called for them to rape German women and girls. Quote, "Kill, kill. In the German race there is nothing but evil, not one among the living, not one among the yet unborn is but evil. Use force to break the racial pride of these German women. Take them as your lawful booty. Kill as you storm onward. Kill, you gallant soldiers of the Red Army." And it wasn't just German women and girls. Millions of women and young girls were brutally raped and tens of thousands murdered throughout Eastern Europe, in the Baltic states, in Poland, Ukraine, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania. But the Jewish media didn't call for prosecution of these murderous Jewish communist fiends. It honored Ehrenberg as a war hero. Jews became triumphant in America after the Second World War, and they quietly initiated torture against their old German enemies. Senator Taft, in sworn congressional testimony before his committee, exposed the systematic barbaric torture of Germans, ironically charged for, quote, war crimes. Judge Edward Van Roden, a member of the Simpson Army Commission, exposed torture of German prisoners after the war. Quote, "All but 2 of the Germans in the 139 cases we investigated had been kicked in the testicles beyond repair." One of the famous judges was Iowa Supreme Court Justice Charles F. Winterstrom. He resigned in disgust at the Jewish treatment of prisoners motivated by hatred of Germans. Quote, "The entire atmosphere is unwholesome," he said. "The lawyers and staff who became Americans only in recent years had backgrounds that were embedded in Europe's hatreds and prejudices." Now back then, torture was hidden from the American people, but nowadays it's openly promoted by the media and Zionist activists. As a truly patriotic American, I demand an end to torture. I demand that both George Bush and Barack Hussein Obama be tried in a court of law for the worst crimes that can be committed against a human being. Ironic, isn't it? The media paints me as the epitome of evil, although there's never been even a single allegation that I've ever caused physical harm to another human being. But murderers and torturers like Bush and Obama are honored by the same media that demonizes me. You see, they choose to promote those who do their evil and demonize those who expose their evil. I am not like them. I don't advocate torture against anyone, and certainly not against George Bush and Barack Obama for their heinous crimes. But committing torture and murder under American law is punishable by the death penalty in a court of law. The very least punishment that George Bush and Barack Obama deserve is spending the rest of their pathetic lives in prison for their crimes against humanity and their crimes against the very laws and principles of America itself. And after we prosecute George Bush and Barack Obama, let's clean out the sewer of Hollywood and the entire Hollywood, New York axis of Zionist media. The people of the world will, when they hear the truth, rise up against the monsters who lead us to torture and war, degeneracy and tyranny. As George Orwell said, in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. I say, let the revolution begin.